Why do people trade? The simple answer is that person A wants something person B has, but in order to get it, person A has to give up something that person B wants. Pretty simple, right? Well, yeah, but in reality, it's a bit more complicated than that. When you take in factors like supply, demand, inflation, competition, monopolies, trade barriers, blah 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 blah, you get the idea. In reality, trade can be a really, really complicated thing. Hell, sometimes, no matter what incentives it may bring or deals you may offer, some folks may just be unwilling to trade regardless. So what to do if person B won't give up their goods? Well, for many throughout the history of Rathnir, the answer was easy. Just take it! This can be seen in 2100 BJC with the First Ardatian Empire. Founded by Ismail Mako, the Ardacian Empire rose from the gold-rich Mesa as the predominant economic powerhouse of the ancient world of the West. Over the millennial Golden Age, the Ardacians would spread across the Sea of Slaves, establishing a burgeoning colonial empire and facilitating what would be known as the Triquetra trade. In this system, a sort of triangular trade would be built around the Sea of Slaves, with, well, as the name suggests, slaves and gold coming from the Talawan and Ardacian Mesa, which would be used to purchase grain and advanced tools from the Aldavir region, and from there be used to fuel efforts to harvest luxury goods in Vastallos. As for that last leg of the trade network, luxury goods is kind of understating it. The warm, wet environment of Vastallos facilitated the growing of very special crops that really couldn't grow anywhere else in the entire hemisphere. Dotted with sugarcane plantations, spice farms, and rare fruit trees, the jungles of Vastallos were awash with items immensely coveted across the old world. However, it would be one of these crops in particular that well and truly drove the Ardacians absolutely cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Chocolate. Cocoa bean farming had been practiced in Vastallos for millennia, growing particularly well in the peripheries of Donk, where the higher elevation yet still tropical ecosystem proved the perfect growing grounds for the Vastallosi breed of the bean. Centuries of growing the plant and selling the plant made Donk incredibly wealthy and a true preeminent power in the region. However, with great power comes great enviability. Envy. With great power comes great envy. Yeah, let's go with that. The incredibly rich status of the Ardacian Empire and the hedonistic values of their culture endured the Ardacians heavily to the cocoa luxury. Within less than a century, chocolate became a staple of the Ardacian diet, being mixed with various other combinations of sugar, grain, fruit, and even coffee to form all kinds of delicious confections. It was even sometimes combined with cocoa leaves and water to form a massively addictive sludge that slave masters used to keep higher quality slaves in line. The Ardacians had well and truly become an empire of chocoholics. This meant that, as their empire grew and grew, so did their demand for chocolate, resulting in massive domestic competition for the best growing lands. A plethora of wars and border skirmishes were fought between the various Vastallosi city-states over the best farmland, all of them wanting to cash in on the booming market. For the Ardacians, this was great. After all, what could be better than numerous nations literally clamoring over each other to try and sell you your favorite thing? Nothing, right? Well, okay, I guess there could be one thing better. Actually owning the land yourselves. And that's exactly what Ardat did. Taking advantage of the domestic turmoil and wanting to get their sweet, sweet chocolate more directly, Ardat began establishing some small trade ports on the coast of Vastallos. At first, the various Vastallosi were fine with this, or even if they weren't, were still far too busy battling each other and cashing in on the chocolate market to care. That was until those small trade ports became massive, expansive, full-on colonies that, more horrifying than anything else, eventually even began growing their own chocolate. Eventually, as the nations of Vastallos got wise to development, and the powerhouses of the continent started losing land right next to them, murmurs finally began of Ardat having stepped over the line, and needed to be put back in their place. However, for most, war still wasn't on the table as a serious option. That was until 2002 BSS, when some Toluan slaves escaped from the Ardacian colony of Caesarea. They fled to the small village of Naukopt in Donk, where the locals took pity on them and let them take refuge. That was all well and good until a few days later, the owner of the plantation, which they escaped from, arrived in the town and demanded that the villagers hand over his property. His property being, the slaves. The villagers refused, and so in response, the slave owner burned down their village, slaughtered the inhabitants, and captured everyone who survived. The rulers of Donkstopt were outraged at this and confronted the colonial governor, who not only refused to do a thing about it, but claimed that the pillaging was punishment for theft, and the kidnapping of innocents was restitution for the stolen property. Suffice to say, this did not go over well with the Vastallosi. Within only a couple of months, a conference had been assembled with leaders from various Vastallosi nations. Similar meetings had been called in the past, but they were all just arranged by Estersia and some small border tribes. The Empire of Estersia, being easily the biggest and most powerful nation in Vastallos, had always called for war against Ardat, although, admittedly, this was largely just because they wanted to take the nearby colonies for themselves, and were spiteful towards any empire that challenged their influence over their smaller neighbors. Now though, with the massive overreach that was the now Kopt massacre, the northern power of Donk stopped, and much of the rest of the continent were firmly against Ardat's rule. At a meeting held in what would later on become Karve, the nations of Estersia, Donkstopt, Karvanas, Illyrix, Kamigawa, and a ton of other smaller little states came together and discussed what to do. At first, despite everything that had happened, many, such as Karve, still argued in favor of a more diplomatic approach, suggesting perhaps embargoing the Ardacians. Estersia and Donkstopt would not have it though, and soon agreed in secret that on their own they would each launch offensives into their respective neighboring colonies. And thus, a couple of months after preparing in secret, in the early spring of 2001 BSS, the First Chocolate War would begin. The twin battles of Voltesian Fields and Basir would both be launched at night, by Estersia and Donkstopt respectively, the coalition forces hoping to catch the Ardacians so off guard that they could simply blitz through the colonies and remove all Ardacian holdings on the mainland before the Empire could respond. If they secure the continent, then it would be a hell of a lot harder for the Ardacians to fight back. In the south, the Estersian ambush was a massive success. Due to the decades-long warlike rhetoric of the Estersians, Ardat had stationed a large garrison of soldiers there. However, also due to the decades of no actual war being fought, the garrison was pretty lazy, not to mention confident that their large army could beat these savages even in their sleep. They didn't even bother posting a night watch. That being said, when they were asleep on that day, they were absolutely slaughtered. Nearly 2/3 of Puerto Morisco's garrison were wiped out without even a fight. Now, their numbers actually did help them in the end, as there were simply too many of them for the Ardacians to get without incident, and soon enough, soldiers awoke to alert what remained of the army and save them from losing their throats. Those few that survived were routed, leaving behind much of their tools and weapons, and fleeing southwards to the fortress city of Gatamiro. The Estersians had absolutely annihilated at the Battle of Voltasian Fields. In the north, though, things were a little different. The border between Donk and Cesario colony was a river, and not a particularly trepid one either. Although they had the advantage of surprise, Donk general Gudbrand II feared that if they were discovered and hadn't made it fully across the river yet, the loss could be catastrophic. So, instead of risking a crossing, General Gudbrand II had his men march around the river, through neutral territory. Now, this wasn't actually quite as bad as it might sound. Borders were a lot looser back then, and it was fairly often that armies had to march through little towns to get on their way to some battle. Not to mention, though the locals may not have been privy to the coalition's plans for Ardat, they certainly weren't fond of Ardat themselves, and weren't about to stop any effort to get rid of the slavers. Well, at least not intentionally. One of the towns Gudbrand had to go through was the small village of Basir, which, due to its central position right on the land bridge that connected the colony of Cesario with the rest of Vastallos, Donk couldn't just dance around the edge of, but had to march directly through. No biggie, right? Well, to the townspeople, definite biggie. Like I said earlier, no one outside the high commands of Donk or Estersia had any idea these attacks were in motion, so to the locals, it didn't look like this army was triumphantly riding through their town to get rid their lands of the hated invaders, but rather, it looked like they were there to, well, invade them. Thus, Basir sprang into defensive mode, fighting back the Donk and worse, sending riders out to notify nearby towns, which, of course, included the colony of Cesario. The Ardacians came and, having lost the surprise, completely annihilated the Donk soldiers. Despite facing a much smaller army than the Estersians, and also having lost the advantage of surprise, Donk had lost. In the aftermath of the twin battles, word from the colonies was sent off immediately to the capital, telling of a near victory in the north and the massive failure in the south. But it would be a while before the message would be able to make it back to Ardat, and longer still before the Empire could mobilize a response. In the meantime, Donk would retreat, Estersia would continue a slow push inwards, and the authorities of both nations would notify the rest of the subcontinent of their actions and call for aid in driving out the invaders. The responses to these calls were mixed. Kuala Lumpur and the rest of the Northeast were far too busy fighting each other to give a damn about the ordeal, while Carve and others called the act brash and idiotic, refusing to support the move. Only a few small border tribes supported the move, having feared subjugation from the Ardacians themselves. During this time, both Estersia and Donk continued their military operations, though each with limited success. Donk was still reeling from its loss at the Battle of Basir and focused on amassing strength from allied border tribes. On the other hand, Estersia, which had performed so well at their end of the bargain, was now getting bogged down in the south. Their initial success at the Battle of Voltasian Fields had allowed them to sweep through with the Ardacian colony of Puerto Narisco, taking nearly all, save a few scattered forts, among them being Gato Morero, or what would later go on to become Griffin View. This fortress city was key in allowing Ardat to resupply Puerto Narisco, and would be crucial to securing the mainland. The Estersians tried to take the fort, but were repelled time and time again, forcing them into a lengthy, prolonged siege. Now though, Emperor Mako had finally begun mobilizing his response. Firstly, he sent General Altair Ramajan from the colony of Isla Rojo with a force of 30,000 to resupply Puerto Narisco. Then, he sent his chief strategist, Tasha Talawan, from the outer islands with a slightly smaller force to resupply Cesario in the north. Finally, he directed the navy to blockade the river around Nasir Bay. Despite the fact that no reports mentioned anything of an attack on the Nasir colony, that didn't mean one wasn't coming, and above all the other Vastallos colonies, Nasir's Bay was far too great a gem to risk losing. With national reinforcements arriving in, the colonial army of Cesario would launch another offensive in the north. However, still not being positive of who had attacked them, they first attacked into the various Mascar tribes, further driving these tribes to send men to join up with General Gutbrand II's army in Donk. Meanwhile, the Ardacian fleet attacked a plethora of neutral fishing fleets along the Illyris River, in their effort to secure the Nasir colony against potential attack. Additionally, the Nocian mercenaries were sent out across the Illyris Peninsula to protect the tribes there against any violence, which basically amounted to occupying them. So now, at this point, you have the Ardacians attacking a bunch of neutral settlements and the coalition armies simply holding their positions, mainly because they couldn't do much else but shh. Suffice to say, at this point, opinion is massively turning against the Ardacians, and more tribes are signing up to fight alongside the coalition. Finally though, in the south, hearing of the incoming reinforcements, General Siamus Ramio directs the Estersians to attack Gathamiro, hoping to capture the fort before the Ardacians can come and lift the siege. The fighting was absolutely brutal. After several attempts, the Estersians managed to take the outer walls, opening the main gate and pouring into the courtyard. The remaining Ardacian defenders retreated to the central tower, holding the small oaken door shoulder to shoulder. If the attackers got beyond this door, it would be a slaughter. They are pushed further and further back, to the point that just a group of 20 men held the enters desperately fighting for survival. Alas though, something happened. The Estersians began to falter, as, from behind, the reinforcements had arrived. They were out of time. General Romeo called for a frantic retreat, the men left outside the walls attempting to hold off the arriving Ardacians so that they could evacuate the Estersians inside the walls. After a mad scramble, the Estersians were routed. The siege of Griffin View was a loss. After the siege of Griffin View, the Estersians moved back to their already captured border regions and assumed defensive positions. Back up in Cesario, though, the coalition forces, now consisting of Donk, several Mascar tribes, Kamigawa, and others, reopened the northern front. With the chief strategist Tasha Talawan remaining in Cesario to oversee coordination, her subordinate, Captain Isali Kopesh, was put in charge of the northern army, and had begun moving southwards in an attempt to capture up to at least the southern river, to secure Cesario before beginning to push into Donk. Despite their initial failure, Donk was still a rather formidable force, and their mountainous hinterland would be an incredible ordeal to capture. Not to mention, she still had to contend with the constant guerrilla fighting by various Mascar tribes. At the same time, in the Illyris Peninsula, the Nocian mercenaries had fully secured the end of the peninsula, with little resistance. Few of the local tribes had outright resisted the Nocians, as it was well known the brutal fate that this private army would wreak upon those who resisted. That being said, they still had to contend with much of the same guerrilla fighting that Kopesh had to deal with from the Mascar. Hearing of the news in Cesario, however, Fabian Nassar rented out the Nocians to Caesar I of Tizu. Though, for a price, of course. The grind don't stop, even for fellow vassals of the same emperor. The Nocians were sent east, setting out immediately to fortify Cesario's flanks, while Kopesh continued to push southwards into the jungle. Soon, she arrived at the southern river, the point where Talawan had instructed her to stop and begin her push eastwards. And now, she could follow us. It was a plan laid out specifically by the royal strategist, and the east flank was in critical danger right now of being overrun by the coalition forces. Although, just hypothetically speaking, she could also push south, cross the river, seize all of the chocolate-rich jungles of the hinterland, and then try to link up with Puerto Narcisco in the south. Oh boy, I mean, if she could do that, she would be a hero, a true legacy, the greatest military mind in all of Ardacian history. Hell, I mean, she'd probably get a plantation. No, not a plantation. She'd probably get a colony of her own. Can you guess what she decided to do? At first, Kopesh's march south had experienced much success. Various Illyric tribes had amassed on the riverbank, but were quickly dispelled by her soldiers, being pushed south again and again and again. However, each time she pushed south, she had to leave behind some men as a garrison, and descend further into wildly unfamiliar jungle terrain. Not to mention, the whole time the Ardacians were being afflicted by the brutal tropical diseases that plagued the Vastallosi hinterland. The Ardacians were sick, lost, and exhausted. And eventually, it simply proved too much. After a particularly rainy night, Kopesh's forces had reached the top of a hill, and looked down to see a plethora of Illyrics and Mascar forces at the bottom, absolutely belting them with arrows. Having the high ground, this appeared to be an easy win. Captain Kopesh told her forces to charge down the hill, which they did. As they reached the bottom though, the ground gave way to rows upon rows of spikeball tracks, hidden under the dense foliage of the jungle. Her cavalry were immediately obliterated by the traps, and those that tried to stop ended up tumbling down the hill. The prior night's rain had left the hill an absolute mudslide, one only made worse by the trampling of hoofs and boots. It was a massacre, and the Ardacians were forced to retreat. Initially, they did so in a measured way, but as they were massively slowed down by the scores of sick and injured among them, they proved vulnerable to the various shock attacks by tribes harassing their escape. Soon, the measured retreat turned into a mad dash for the river, the Ardacians losing a gargantuan amount of soldiers in their multi-day retreat through the jungle. Of all the various campaigns of the war, Kopesh's march south would be easily the deadliest, with over 20,000 casualties just on the Ardacian side alone. After a year-long campaign, Captain Kopesh's armies were beaten back to the other side of the river, having gained no extra territory and having suffered a truly ridiculous amount of deaths. During all this time, the Estersians had not been sitting idle in the south. The front between Estersia and Puerto Narcisco had been in a near constant flux. One side would take one fort along the border, only to then leave that fort and take another, while at the same time, the other side would be leaving their own fort to take the one just abandoned, and repeat. Although simplified, this basic cycle went on and on for quite some time. The Ardacians and Estersians trading off border regions, slowly losing to costly sieges and cumbersome garrisons. Clearly, something had to change. In order to break the stalemate, General Ramajan sent a detachment off to invade the tribes to the northwest of Puerto Narcisco. While this may seem somewhat nonsensical, it really was a smart move. The tribes in this region had long since been supporting Estersia, whether by sending soldiers to reinforce their army, or by engaging in similar guerrilla tactics to distract the Ardacians on the periphery of their territory. But even though this tactic had sound reasoning, would it be successful? The answer was yes. With the greater infrastructure and mapping of the surrounding area that the southern colony had, they were able to absolutely annihilate the defenders in the region, cutting off Estersia from support, and making it so General Altair Ramajan could refocus his forces against Estersia. This is where the collapse finally begins. In order to combat the coming army and to hold the already captured border regions, the Empire of Estersia had been massively taxing its people. The war, by this point having gone on for close to 9 years, had been exhaustive for the Estersian people and aristocracy alike. Naval blockades had starved the economy, and the people were being pushed into overdrive to fuel the war effort. By this point, many were simply fed up. Furthering on pre-existing social tensions that predated the war, rebellion began in the east, led by old senators demanding their long bygone powers and led by citizens demanding better treatment. The rebellion rapidly spread through the empire, and soon the Estersians had to abandon Puerto Morisco entirely to put them down. Soon, with the capital under threat and the country in full disarray, Estersia would be forced to make peace with Ardac, ending the war in the south. In the north, though, war would continue on. Kopesh's disastrous Great March south had left the Nocian mercenaries alone in defending against coalition forces, but now that they were finally back, though heavily battered, they could go back on the offensive. A series of brutal campaigns in the jungle pushed Donk back to the border, then past it. The coalition was pushed all the way back to here, where the final, titular battle of the war would take place. The Siege of Blackstone Keep. The armies of General Gudbrand held well, raining volleys of javelins, arrows, stones, and flaming oil onto the Ardacian besiegers. The mountainous terrain made it almost impossible to mine tunnels underneath, and the weight of what defeat would mean pushed the defenders to fight desperately. However, after a brutal 2 months of holding out, the starving defenders at last faltered, with the Nocians being the ones to launch the last assault needed to force a surrender. Thus, with their loss at Blackstone Keep, Donk finally capitulated, ending the First Chocolate War. The Ardacian Empire was victorious. The aftermath of the war saw seismic changes across the continent of Vastallos. Ardat spread and strengthened their hold over land, with new colonies and forcing many of the native tribes into a protectorate status, which basically amounted to colonization with extra steps. For their valor, the Nocians themselves were given a private colony of their own, from land carved out of Donk, which would actually have pretty significant repercussions for the time to come. Estersia's revolution would continue long after the end of the war, and the turmoil brought on by it would spell the end of the empire for centuries to come. Donk would come out comparatively unscathed, but rebellions of their own would continue to weaken the state. Although many future attempts would be made to dislodge the Ardacian colonizers, they would all largely fail. The Vastallosi never able to muster the same power and unity they had in their first coalition. Now, eventually, the Ardacians would begin to lose influence over Vastallos, but that would take a very, very long time, during which the natives of the continent would still be brutally oppressed and exploited for the purpose of fueling the Ardacian Colonial Empire. Of course, when that collapse finally came, ironically, it would be to another colonial empire. Special thanks to Axolotl, Corey, Serpantios, Quarties, Anvi, Delatra, and of course, my man Stony, especially for the arrow animation. That was very helpful. As always, this was all done on the Stoneworks Minecraft Worldbuilding server, a hub for creative lore builders and all the like. If you're interested, please join in the link below today. And finally, with that, please, for the love of God, subscribe. I only upload every 3 months anyways. Come on, do it, do it, do it!